Hello and welcome to this video. Let's try and get a little bit more straighter there. I hope I'm in view. I think I'm a little bit over to the side, aren't I? Right, so on this video, what I'm going to be going through is 10 albums that are incredibly proggy. That's the only way I could describe it. These will be the 10 most proggy albums of the 1970s. Often when I do lists of the best progressive rock bands or albums, which I know this channel, people love that, you have to take into account certain albums that are less proggy but are absolutely brilliant and are sort of within the genre. And then the prog aficionados will often come in, if I'm talking a band like Rush or Pink Floyd, will say, well, they're not really a prog band, are they? And I will get criticism for that. We all know what prog is. Prog is overblown, classically influenced music that with long compositions. It's based upon folklore or mythology, or sometimes sort of dystopian, futuristic scenarios with lots of complexity, virtuosity, odd time signatures, conceptual ideas that pull whole albums together. These are all the things that we associate with progressive rock. So I thought, well, which albums do that the most extreme? You know, which were the albums where they take the progressive aesthetic and push it out to an absolute outer limit of prog? All right, so I've come up with 10 albums. I've tried to rank them. Well, I have ranked them, and they will also explore different aspects of outlandish progginess. So shall we kick on with this list? So at number 10 on my list, I have In Praise of Learning by Henry Cow. Let's start with something dark, impenetrable, avant-garde, way out. This is the sort of album that normal people could not deal with, right? Henry Cow was formed in 1968. I think it was Tim Hodgkinson, Chris Cutler, and Fred Frith. They sort of come out of the Canterbury scene, but they're a lot more darker and avant-garde than a lot of the bands associated with that. Henry Cow combines sort of modern classical elements, avant-garde elements, free improvisation, and they've got a very strong left-wing Marxist aspect to them. If you imagine, if you haven't heard Henry Cow, if you imagine a very English Marxist version of Frank Zappa and the Mothers when they're at the extreme end, Henry Cow are probably one of the few bands that exist in rock music that make compositions as complex as Frank Zappa. This stuff is dense. I think they made their first album in 1971, and there was a lot of elements thrown together in those early albums. By the time we get to In Praise of Learning by 1975, I feel that album actually coalesces a whole bunch of different aspects together. The album before this was called Desperate Straits, so that came out in 1974, and that was a collaboration with a band called Slap Happy, including the musicians Peter Blelvad and Anthony Moore. That collaboration really works. So we've got the same collaboration on this album, In Praise of Learning. And that includes the vocals of Dagmar Krause. And this vocal, I feel, pushes this album to the outer limits of prog. This is as extreme as Henry Cow ever get, but there's also vocals on there. And vocals are really important. If you were to take any avant-garde album, you know, if you were to take like a free jazz album, like, I don't know, like Ascension by John Coltrane, and then orchestrate vocals into there, suddenly it moves from being an avant-garde jazz album to being very proggy. And I feel that this album is very, very proggy indeed. There's an epic on here called Living in the Heart of the Beast. It's a Tim Hodgkinson composition, and it's 16 minutes long, and it's out there, right? This isn't like Trap Mass Replica or Metal Machine music. This is dense, orchestrated, complex music, which does all sorts of different things. We've also got songs like Beautiful as the Moon, Terrible as the Army with Banners. which has got full-on lyrics and is much more song-based. In Praise of Learning, this title comes from a Bertolt Brecht line, I think, and we could see the aesthetics of Kurt Weill, Bertolt Brecht, avant-garde, revolutionary music, which is something we don't normally see with progressive rock. Progressive rock is usually very airy-fairy, isn't it? Yes, Genesis and Jethro Tull. Well, Jethro Tull can have an edge as well. You know, Jethro Tull and Aqualung can have an edge, but nothing like this. So that's the album I've got at number 10 anyway, is In Praise of Learning by Henry Cow. And that is the first time I've spoken about Henry Cow on this channel. I'm no huge expert of Henry Cow. I know I've a rough idea of the basic albums. There's bands, spin-off bands like the Art Bears, and Chris Cutler, the drummer, then went on to work with Bill Laswell in Material, and Fred Frith went on to work with John Zorn in Naked City and other collaborations. And that's where I know those musicians from. And I'm yet to really deeply explore this world, because again, it's like all great bands, they have created their own world. And isn't that fundamentally what progressive rock is? Progressive rock is where artists or bands don't just create music, but they create their own world in which that music can inhabit. Right, so that's the most out there prog. Let's get the most in prog that we can get, right? So, you know, at the beginning I said, you know, sometimes I get criticised for covering bands that aren't prog. There's two bands that often come up with this, and I've done videos on both of whether these bands are prog. The first is Pink Floyd, and the second one is Rush. Now, I think the problem with Rush is for most of their career, they're not really a progressive rock band. They're a progressive rock influenced band. But from Fly By Night, I would say, up until maybe Moving Pictures, although we could say that Moving Pictures and the album before, Permanent Waves, are moving away from prog. But in the middle of that, Caress of Steel, 2112, Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres are all full-on prog albums, and it's undeniable. So going from Henry Cow, which is a pretty obscure band, let's go to a stadium-filling, you know, multi-million selling band, you know, one of the greatest rock bands in rock history. Because in the middle of their catalogue, we have the album Farewell to Kings, which is what I've got on number 9. And this album is about as proggy as it gets. From the opening track title with that sort of medieval finger-picked acoustic guitar, which moves from speaker to speaker as Alex Lifeson walks across the quadrangle over at Rockfield in the deepest, darkest South Wales, you know, between two microphones to get that panning effect. And then it comes in with this sort of majestic opening, which is at the same time rock, but is also has a fanfare and a sort of English madrigal about it. And I think there's a track on here called Madrigal as well. That's followed up by, I think, probably Rush's greatest epic. It's hard. I mean, they've done some great epics. I do not think 2112 and Hemispheres are the great epics. I would say the two greatest epics are on this album, and the most complete and beautifully composed is Xanadu, that finishes up side 1 of that. On side 2, we have Close to the Heart, which is full on prog, but is a pop song. And then we got Cinderella Man and Madrigal. I can't remember. And then we finish with Cygnus X1, another one of their greatest epics. Xanadu explores all the sort of mythical, sort of literate references that prog does best. And on Cygnus X1, we have that futuristic aesthetic, you know, of some people in a spaceship flying into a black hole. And I think the spaceship's called Rocinante, which, if I'm correct, isn't that the horse in The Man from La Mancha, Don Quixote? So the literary references are in there. I might have got that completely wrong, because I didn't plan to talk about that, just popped into my head. Because the album, each side is bookended with these epics, and they both explore two aesthetics that we get in progressive rock. You know, the old prog bands are always pulling in from some sort of literate, you know, historic, mythical Lord of the Rings type of aesthetic. And now with bands like Dream Theater, you know that if they're going to do any sort of prog metal band, if they're going to do a concept album, it would be some sort of science fiction, futuristic, dystopian thing. And Rush managed to do both on this album. It's an incredible album. I think it's worth considering the title of this, which is Farewell to Kings. Rush are an intelligent band and they know what they're doing. So when Neil Peart comes in and he brings in this Tolkien aesthetic, I think they realised going into 1976 that aesthetic was a bit passé. It was a bit silly in a way, and they knew they were about to move on to other areas. It takes them a while to work out where they're going to go, but I think Neil Peart was always interested in the psychological aspects of human existence. He's a real philosopher, and so I think this was an attempt to sort of almost wave goodbye to all those progressive rock tendencies, but to use it to pose questions of existence, very much like Pink Floyd did with Dark Side of the Moon. Anyway, right, so I'm going to now move on from Rush to the band that I call Prog's prog band, right? So prog exists as this sort of outlandish, decadent, complex, intellectual, esoteric heart of rock music. It's the intelligent, esoteric heart of rock music, let us say. The music critics don't like that. They like to be the ones that seem to be intelligent, not the bands, but we know that a lot of the people behind progressive rock bands are highly educated and are very virtuoso on the instruments, and that tends to bring in sort of English middle-class gentlemen a lot of the time, who'd had that sort of university education. That's why there's so many PhDs hanging around. You think of Brian May sat there with his big hair and his clogs, and he's got a PhD in astrophysics, or astronomy, or whatever it is. Anyway, I'm digressing, aren't I? So if we take that heart, in there is another band that takes all the aspects of progressive rock and just amps them up to the max. And any of their albums, except for a couple I could have picked, but the album I'm going to go for at number 8 is Acquiring the Taste by Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant, of course, was it Southampton-based band that first emerged behind Simon Dupree on his hit record Kites. Then they decide they want to do something else. They want to explore something that's more uncommercial, more experimental. They want to do the real deal, and they do their first album, Gentle Giant, which is a prog masterpiece, although the elements of Gentle Giant are not coalesced. When they go into their second album, you can tell they go balls out prog, right? This is prog. It's so outlandishly prog. And it's where I believe Gentle Giant are really coalescing their their specific prog approach, which is to have rather than borrowing from romantic composers like Yes and Genesis, they're borrowing from a more modern classical aesthetic, and they have a compositional device of having a line that runs through and moves from one aspect of the band to the next. So you get this shattering of the melody or riffs, very complex, very mathematical. And then the lyrics are often very existentialist, right? They are also questioning existence and how we sit in the world and how that works. On Acquiring the Taste, I've always felt this is the album where they just go, what can we do? So it's even more experimental, and in a way not quite as delineated and concise as something like Power and the Glory or In a Glass House or Freehand. All those albums in the mid-period are genius albums. I feel they're greater albums. And one of the things with Gentle Giant is they once they have their idea, they actually bring it quite down. They're very concise. They're never pretentious or outlandish, and their tracks are usually very short, pop song length, 5-6 minutes maybe. But within that, you get the elements of a prog rock epic within that. On Acquiring the Taste, they extend out, and there's a lot more weird progginess. I think this album came out in, was it 71 or 72, something like that. So we're right in that climbing up the mountain peak of prog, where we get to this sort of excess of 1973, which would be for them Octopus, which is probably their greatest album. The one before that is Three Friends, which is their great conceptual album. Any of these albums could be on this list, but I'm going for Acquiring the Taste, and I'm hoping Gentle Giant fans will back me up that if you want a real dose of out-and-out prog, Acquiring the Taste is the one to go for. So, what have you got at number 7? I couldn't not have Emerson, Lake and Palmer on this list. And anybody who's watched this channel for a long time knows that I started out as a bit of a Emerson, Lake and Palmer hater, and then as time's gone on and I've had to do the research required to do this channel, my opinion of Emerson, Lake and Palmer has improved immensely, and I'm finding myself even going back to albums like Works 2, which I always thought were awful, and listening to them again and realising the brilliance of this band. I was often put off by the sort of what I call the Mrs. Mills influence in Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Mrs. Mills was a sort of singer that would sort of play this barrel house boogie woogie in the UK 1950s and 1960s. Definitely an influence on Keith Emerson. And he does have a tendency to go down that rattly Cockney piano route. And he does on this album, and it always put me off it. And now I've realised that in the Emerson, Lake and Palmer Ying, the yang to their yin is that comedy element. And I should know that the little bit of comedy, right, goes a long way because it punctures the pretentiousness. You know, what did John Peel say about Emerson, Lake and Palmer? That it was a waste of talent and electricity. This Emerson, Lake and Palmer personify outlandishness and progginess in music. They're the ones that if we had a documentary, they were poking fun, as they always do, trying to notch down the incredible artistic achievements of progressive rock. If you were watching one of those documentaries, you know straight off, okay, you would see Keith Emerson sticking daggers in his keyboard, and then we would get that shot of the Emerson, Lake and Palmer juggernauts with their names on the top, and they would point out that nobody could see them, as though they were idiots and didn't know that, not realising that what Emerson, Lake and Palmer were doing was just being absolutely outlandish, and we could see them because someone's in a helicopter filming them, which they would have paid for. So which album do I go for? My favourite album by Emerson, Lake and Palmer is Trilogy. I've decided after much exploration on this channel, I love Trilogy best. But Brain Salad Surgery is the one I've got at number 7. It's just so dark and intense. The epic is so big it splatters over more than one side. It's half of side 1 and then the rest of side 2. It's outlandish and virtuoso. It's whatever it's about. I ain't got a clue what it's about. You know, it's obviously some sort of futuristic dystopian nightmare envisaged on Hammond organ. It's a wonderful album. I was always a little bit... I didn't like Jerusalem on there, and I didn't like Benny the Bouncer on there. That was what ruined that album for me. And Jerusalem being the opening track, I was like, oh, this is a lame version of this sort of English hymn. But if we step back and think aesthetically what Emerson, Lake and Palmer do, it's personified in that Jerusalem track, to be honest. And if you don't like that, you don't like prog, and maybe I don't fully like prog. Maybe that's why I have a tendency more towards jazz fusion. But this is an incredible album. And then the H.R. Giger artwork just pushes it to the max. You know, that gatefold sleeve and all that sort of stuff. And it's so serious and dark. But of course, this is all pointing to something quite salacious and, you know, X-rated, isn't it? That I don't want to get into on my channel. I don't go there on my channel. But if you want to look into it, about the album artwork and whatever, I don't know what Brain Salad Surgery means, but maybe I do. I don't know. I'll point that for those who don't know and they want to go Googling it. But don't say I sent you there, will you? Right, that's got nothing to do with me. So that's what I've got at number 7 is Brain Salad Surgery. We know, one of the great proggy albums. So what have I got at number 6, right? This is the band that are so out and out prog, but never get mentioned in the prog lists, you know, prog bands like Pink Floyd, Yes, Genesis, King Crimson. That's what everyone normally says. People don't say Jethro Tull, do they? And Jethro Tull were an arena filling band. They sold millions and millions of records. They were on the same level as a Led Zeppelin. You know, this was a huge band. Then you go and listen to the albums. And of course, you know, Jethro Tull start out as almost like like a blues band, really, but they've got prog interests. We get Benefit, Mick Abrams is sent out, Ian Anderson gets it under control, and then by Stand Up, they're bringing in these progressive elements. And then he does Aqualung, and I think Aqualung is just a normal album for the songs, but in the prog rock zeitgeist, it got picked up as being a conceptual album. I think of it as a conceptual album, but it's not. And I think Jethro Tull, Ian Anderson sat around and go, all right, then if you want a conceptual album, we'll give you one. And he did Thick as a Brick, which I nearly put on the list, which is an incredible album that just has got one track, which is loads of little different elements of over the whole album. There's aspects of that album where things are just extended with improvisation and stuff like that, but it is a groundbreaking album. But when they go back into the studio for the next album, which is Passion Play, which is what I have at number 6, they are even better at making these huge prog rock dense epics, which are at once incredibly musically deep, but there's also an absurdist sense of humour. Jethro Tull often has this almost like Edward Lear, Alice in Wonderland aesthetic going through it, and Passion Play is no exception. Passion Play is just so incredibly competent in terms of progressive rock. Never on the whole length of this album, which is really just one track, do you feel that the band is running out of wind or is not in control of the structural scope of this album. It's got some incredible melodies. The interlude, the story of the hare who lost his spectacles, which is this sort of very Edward Lear, almost like the Walrus and the Carpenter thing out of Alice in Wonderland. And then it goes into, I think it's Forest Dance. And that section of music that comes in after that, running to the end of the album, is some of the most incredible progressive rock, and it is not Bungle in the Jungle. Right? With these albums at this point in time, I get confused, as I just did. Anyway, what's interesting about this album is this album, I think, came out in 1974, didn't it? Is it 73 or 74? It was released March 73. The critics panned it. I think this album could well be the first album where the critics decide to turn on progressive rock. Because this is 1973. All the other albums that are coming out, like Tubular Bells and Dark Side of the Moon, everyone's raving about, and they're all great. But I think this is so incredibly dense. I can understand that a band of that size that occupy that place in rock, the pantheon of rock at that time, this is a stadium filling band. I think that the critics were just like, what the hell's this? This is very intense music. It's very intense. And I think the reputation of this album has been that it is clinical and dry. Now, in the past, when we've talked about great progressive rock albums, there's been people in the comments saying, what about Passion Play, Andy? What about Passion Play? And I went, yeah, it doesn't have the edge over Thick as a Brick. Thick as a Brick is much more exuberant and funnier, and that one's not funny. It's just a big slab of dense progressive rock. And I went back and listened to it again. No, it's not. It's funny and quirky, and it's massively in control. And the other thing I need to say about that album is... this is the first album, I think, with Barrymore Barlow on drums. It's definitely Barrymore Barlow on drums. Barrymore Barlow is described by John Bonham as the greatest rock drummer in the world. And at that time, in terms of rock drummers, he probably was. Now, Barrymore Barlow was and is a self-taught musician. God knows how he ended up being able to play this. And his ability to play these incredible compositions, I think that's what amps this one up beyond Thick as a Brick. And I think that's why the critics can't cope with it, because it's too dense. Well, I'm going to move on now to another band I'm not totally aware, knowledgeable on, even less than Jethro Tull. So you're going to have to struggle. You're going to have to watch me struggle now, because this band's Italian, which means I'm going to have to read out foreign words, which I am really bad at. So sorry, people of Italy. I am now about to butcher your beautiful language, right? So Of European prog bands, a lot of them are krautrock bands, and I've got to be honest, I don't really class that as progressive rock. Brilliant though it is, that's avant-garde rock, that's something else, right? There's a few bands out in Europe. I think Focus is one that actually are a progressive rock band, but Focus can often also be a jazz rock band, and when they're doing epics, the reason their tracks are very long is usually because there's a lot of solo space to their incredible players, including Jan Ackerman on guitar. The Italian prog bands like Lil May, all those sort of things, they are proper prog. Now, the greatest of those, in my opinion, was the band Premiata Formeria Marconi, which I will shorten, as everyone does, to PFM. Right? Now, this band, I think they formed in 1970. Their first album, I'm going to have to read that, was called Storia di un Minuto, which came out in 1972. And then in 1972, straight on, a few months later, they released Per un Amico, which I think is one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. PFM are different to the other Italian progressive rock bands. They are just so much more competent, virtuoso musicians able to stitch together some of the most complex, dense albums, very much like Jethro Tull, very much like a Passion Play, that level of complexity, which is why they get on the list. In 1973, they bring out Photos of Ghosts, which I think was a compilation, sort of. And then in 74, we get this album, which is called L'isola di Niente. And that is the album that I've got at whatever number I was on. When I started this, I think we're at number 5. This is full on prog, right? This is full on prog. And I think a lot of prog fans who like Yes and Genesis and Jethro Tull, they may not know this album. Go and check it out. And it opens up with an epic, a 10-minute epic called L'isola di Niente, which I think means something like Island of Nowhere or Island of Nothingness or something like that. It's 10 minutes 48 seconds long. I've got all the information here. You can tell because I'm not confident on this band. Let me talk about it from my opinion. It's just, you don't want me just reading off Wikipedia, do you? Right. So the thing with PFM is there's a virtuoso level, and there's also an influence from jazz rock, which they integrate really well into the prog, probably because they're Italian and they don't bring in the Americanizations that you associate with prog. On this album, especially on the title track, they seem to have some sort of way of emulating a choir. It could be a mellotron, but it doesn't sound like a mellotron. The album actually opens up with this huge choir. I thought it was a real choir, but looking into it, it looks like it's some sort of tape choir. It's unbelievable. It's probably the most progressive rock sound ever made. Every time I hear this choir come in, I feel like I should be sat in some sort of white palatial columned, Platonic domain in a white robe with a long hair and a goatee beard, playing a lute and eating grapes. That's what I feel I should be doing when every time I hear it. And this comes in and they orchestrate it really well on this album. At this point, when they came out, they then got discovered by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And at that point, Emerson, Lake and Palmer had set up their Manticore label. And that's when this album was made on Manticore. We actually see Pete Sinfield cropping up on the track Is My Face on Straight, which has got English lyrics. So this was their big attempt to sort of break into the progressive rock world with the LP behind them. And I think the reason why it didn't happen, because this is 1974 and we're on the downward slide, and stuff's going somewhere else. This exists in that area, 73, 74, when prog was so outlandish and was just pushing itself a little bit beyond, what you could expect as being reasonable for a major level, label band, trying to, sell records to a mainstream audience, which people like Pink Floyd and Yes had been able to do. And I think that's why this has not gone down as a classic. But go and listen to it. The band is on fire, and the complexity and the density of this album is something else. Right, I'm now going to move on to stuff I know a little bit more about. So at number 4, I have probably, well, we're getting into some proggy albums. I was going to say this is like the most proggiest album ever made, but if it is, it should be at number 1. And there's a reason why it isn't number one, and I'll tell you why. But the album I've got at number 4, get on with it, Andy. The album I've got at number 4 is Olias of Sun Hilo, the first solo album by John Anderson. So, what can we say about this album? So, after, when would it be? Relayer, I think. They all decide to go off and do their solo albums. Now, this seemed to happen to a lot of prog bands at this point. Pink Floyd had done it on Ummagumma very unsuccessfully. And Emerson, Lake and Palmer were about to do it on their Works albums under the Emerson, Lake and Palmer banner. Whereas with Yes, the members go off to make their own solo albums. And there's some really great albums in there. Of course, for Yes fans, Fish Out of Water by Chris Squire is probably the great album. Beginnings by Steve Harris, another great album. John Anderson, what's else he going to do? He's not a virtuoso musician. You know, he's a guy with an acoustic guitar and a tambourine, you know, and a lot of lyrics that don't make sense. Well, what he did was take those elements and push it to the absolute extreme. The lyrics really don't make sense. I'm not going to go into the sort of concept behind this album, but it's something to do with some sort of almost like Avatar-esque situation. I'm pretty sure, yes, Roger Dean invented Avatar. I'm pretty sure, and I think Olias of Sun Hilo, which is sort of this, I don't know what it's about. It's like, is it in some strange language, or is it in just John Anderson's impenetrable lyrics? I haven't got a clue what this album's about. I got it when I was young. I thought it was incredible. John Anderson's gone into the studio with a bunch of analog synths, some percussion, some acoustic guitar, his set of mad concepts, his mad impenetrable lyrics, and he's stitched together an album that is so futuristic sounding. It's incredible. It's like an esoteric Tubular Bells, and it's beautiful. And he didn't get Roger Dean in, he got some other guy to come in, and so you get this iconic artwork, which I've never seen anywhere else, and it gives the album a look of, you know, when you bought the big vinyl album, it almost had this like Ripping Yarns-esque sort of, imagine you were in a sort of English professor's study at the turn of the century going through his items, and you find this book of esoteric tales, and you open it up, this leather-bound book. It seemed to have that aspect to it. John Anderson pulled something off here that was really, really incredible. It's a monumental album. It's recently been remixed and put out in a big package, and I think it's one of the great progressive rock albums. So why is it not a number one? Well, it's because it lacks that virtuoso element, and it shows how prog is not really about virtuosity, and that John Anderson, of all the people, I think John Anderson is the protector of the flame of what is prog. I really do. I think John Anderson's is he personifies prog in a way, in the way, same way as Robert Plant personifies outlandish rock music, and the same way Ozzy Osbourne personifies heavy metal. For me, John Anderson is prog. And the aesthetic is just so fully realised on this album, Olias of Sun Hilo. If you haven't heard it, go and check it out. If you're a Yes fan, approach with caution. Don't expect to be hearing Close to the Edge. You know, there's no drums on here. It's just analog 6 percussion. But it's beautiful, and it isn't just airy-fairy nonsense as well. There's so much going on. I absolutely love Olias of Sun Hilo. So, right, at number 3, I have The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. The album that Genesis just pushed their aesthetic a little bit too far, didn't they? I have spoken about this album over and over again, and I'm not going to get into all the facts behind it like I have. Go and search it out on other videos and you will find it. If you ask me what my favourite Genesis album is, it's going to be a toss-up between Nursery Crime and Lamb Lies Down. Nursery Crime for me personifies the prog aesthetic of Genesis, that quirky English Alice in Wonderland, but slightly dark, you know, and macabre, a little bit like those sort of Hammer anthology films you often would get in the 1970s. Genesis have that aspect to them, and they explore it really brilliantly on 4 albums, starting with Trespass, and then Nursery Crime, and then Foxtrot, and then Selling England by the Pound. Those are the albums. Now, Genesis have been around for 50 years, but really, when we're talking about prog, those are the albums. Now, when I was a kid, my favourite album was Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. That was the great prog statement, but it's not like Genesis. This is Peter Gabriel stepping out in much the same way Roger Waters stepped out with Dark Side of the Moon and then Animals. It's an aesthetic that Peter Gabriel wants to explore, which comes from America, comes from, you know, rhythm and blues, and those aspects are in there. And suddenly that English quirkiness is there. It's definitely there, but it's used in this sort of conceit, because the album plays out like a Hollywood musical. So it's very much an English person's take on American aesthetics, to the point where, you know, at one point Peter Gabriel just trots out a list of sort of American cliches, you know, drum majorettes smoking Winston cigarettes, all that thing. I think is a very English. It personifies what rock music is. It personifies that idea of bands like the Beatles in the 60s taking in American rhythm and blues and rock and roll, and then regurgitating it through this sort of music hall parody, which we see in Sgt. Pepper, and that's on this album as well. The point is, it doesn't sound like a Genesis album totally. Musically, there's trademarks Genesis things in there, but there's no quirky, there's no Battle of Epping Forest on this one. Then once Gabriel leaves, we get Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering, which are 2 incredible progressive rock albums, but we have this new aesthetic, which is sleeker in a way, and the sleekness alienates Steve Hackett, who leaves, and then we're left with that sound, you know. And how do they take that into the 1980s? Well, it becomes Abacab and Mama and all that stuff, doesn't it? And Phil Collins becomes one of the biggest solo acts in history. It's just a bizarre story. It was proof that God exists, because how could that happen? You know. Anyway, what can I say about Lamb Lies Down on Broadway? It is so outlandish. It's so out there, right? It's brilliantly realised. It's brilliantly played. Some people say it sags, you know, towards the sort of 3rd and 4th of the album, you know, sides. I'm not quite too sure what they're on about with that, you know, because I sat there reading the story, so I was enthralled in this story, which, although is weird, has narrative sense, so you can follow it. And it's a little bit sort of like it's like a voyage through the underworld. It's a bit like a Pilgrim's Progress type of story. So you know, Rael is having a bunch of sort of psychedelic experiences, which seem to be almost like an edible fear of castration, perhaps. It seems that is running through. It's just so proggy. Lamb Lies Down is so proggy, and I think in a way it just does not get mentioned in the same breath as A Dark Side of the Moon or Close to the Edge, and I think that's not right, because I think it's up there with that. And I'm trying to explain all the reasons, I think, because it doesn't fit in to the Genesis narrative that well. So people are troubled by it, you know. And so people will go Selling England by the Pound's the greatest album, you know. But for me, there's, you know, like Battle of Epping Forest, there's so much stuff that just goes on for too long on that album. And you haven't got that. Foxtrot is pretty incredible as well. I am wittering on. The point is, those albums deliver what prog Genesis is supposed to deliver. Lamb Lies Down doesn't, and I think that White doesn't get the love it should, which is why I've got it at number 3. Right, I've cheated at number 2. It had to go on. All right, at number 2, I have 3 albums all together, and it is the Flying Teapot trilogy by Gong. Right, these albums do all belong together. Gong could have released them all together as a box set. The story that it tells, which is of some potted pixies flying around the universe in a teapot, and they come to Earth, and they meet on Earth Zero, the hero, and they have a whole bunch of psychedelic adventures. They go on deeper and deeper and deeper until it's all wound up on the third album, You, with Angel's Egg in the middle. These 3 albums, right? And you could see I am struggling to tell the story because, unlike Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, I have never followed the story of the Flying Teapot trilogy. You do on the first album, and then it gets very convoluted on Angel's Egg, and then when we get to You, it's almost like we're blitzed. We're in our own world, you know, and it's like you're in the middle of this psychedelic experience, which is only interrupted when the cops knock on the door. You know, this is a bizarre album. Gong, one of the great progressive rock bands. They sound incredible. They're light and airy and complex. You know, they're just one of the great bands. This is about as outlandish as you can get. I mean, it really, you have to see it as a triple album. It's Gong's great statement. Camembert Electric is great, which goes before. Shamal that comes after is good. And then they split off, and we get Mother Gong, and we get David Allen's Gong, and we get the, you know, Pierre Morland's Gong, which is more of a jazz rock fusion, one of the great jazz rock fusion bands. And so we Gong, you've got Gong Live as well, but in terms of Gong, these 3 albums are where it's at. And so that's really interesting. It's compacted. And it's the most prog thing you've ever heard. Sit down and listen to it. And the thing is, it's funny. And I think this is the thing about prog when it is its best. People say it's pretentious and overblown, as though these artists are somehow trying to make some great artistic statement, but really what they're trying to do is go out and gig and give the audience the experience that they've never had before and entertain them. And so many of these progressive rock bands seem to have an element to the music hall which channels through the Beatles, like I've said on Sgt. Pepper, and it's on this album. It's funny, it's entertaining, and it's also incredibly dark and deep and out there. The ideas that they're exploring are really going to lay the foundation, I believe, to the way English people or British people dealt with house music in the early 90s. You know, house music being sort of the gay disco sound that was in warehouses in America. When they landed in England, it turned into this hippie new age traveller thing of people travelling around in fields, getting muddy, you know, and basically sat there off their heads, you know, with their dreadlocks swaying, you know, with their little kids running around in some sort of, you know, pastoral utopia that they believed was the way we should all live. In other words, the Woodstock aesthetic came back. And I think it's Gong, who had been talking about new age ideas and Gaia and all this stuff right back in the early 70s. It's out and out prog. So what have I got at number 1? At number 1, I have Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. I told you John Anderson's he's the keeper of the flame of prog. And as prog ascends up the mountain of prog, Yes are not one of the pioneers of prog, but once they get their feet stuck in, which is on the Yes album, 1971, they're late to the party, but once they're in there and they start to pull it together, prog is Yes for me. And you go up this steady steps from the Yes album to Fragile, from Fragile to Close to the Edge. And can you get more prog than Close to the Edge? Yes, you can. It's Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, there's nothing wrong with Tales from Topographic Oceans. In much the same way as the ELP personify the outlandishness of progressive rock in band form, Yes personify it in album form. Because, of course, Tales from Topographic Oceans is where Yes lots the plot, and they've spent like about 6 months in the studio, sat on hay bales because they wanted to record it in a farm with some plastic cow that you could milk. While Rick Makeman got more and more grumpy because he wanted to get out and have his solo career doing his Six Wives of Henry VIII, and he thought there was too much faffing around with, you know, some weird Eastern philosophy that come from some yogi, and he just wanted to sit there eating his curries on stage to show his disgust of all this album. If they just cut it down to one album, it would have been great. And that's all that's happened. That's all gone into folklore. That if we have a progressive rock documentary, that's what they're going to say about Tales from Topographic Oceans. Now, I've said this a million times. I sort of had that because as a young kid, being into In the Heart of the Sunrise and all that, and Bill Bruford and all, I loved all the drumming. When I got Topographic Oceans, I sat down and it was a little bit heavy going, especially side 2. Very heavy going. And I'll tell you what was heavy going. It seems like it was a keyboard. It was Rick Wakeman that was heavy going to me. I don't know. I think people hated the Ancient, where Alan White stepped forward and did that. It sounds like ancient drumming. It's brilliant. Steve Howe's all over the place on the guitar with all that slide guitar. And Ritual is one of their great epics. I mean, yeah, Ritual is one of their great epics. Nous sommes du soleil. All of it's brilliant, right? But it's heavy going. If you want to find a double album of Yes doing out-and-out prog in 1973, the sort of mountain peak of prog historically, it's going to be like that. What do you expect? Anyway, I never listened to it that much. It was heavy going for me when I was 14 years old. I've got to be honest, it was, So I didn't listen to it that much. Well, I did. I listened to The Ancient because I love the drumming, and I listened to Ritual. I never listened to the first disc. Quite recently, when I got one of them Google little things that looks like a black, hamburger, what's it called? Nest or whatever it's called. What's it called? The little thing, and you go, "Hey Google," and then you could say, "Hey Google, play me some prog," and it'll go, I cannot play you prog because you haven't paid for Amazon Prime or something, so you're going to have a compilation album, and then suddenly you get ELO start up. It's not prog. What the hell's this? And then you get 10cc. What's going on? Hey Google, can you play me some Mavish Duxture? I cannot play you Mavish Duxture, but I can play you some stuff that sounds a bit like the Mavish Duxture. You get Dixie Dregs. Right? Because you've got to pay the money, haven't you? Anyway, very frustrated I was when I first got this, whatever it's called, Google Nest Pod thing, whatever it's called, that I put it on and I said, play me some Frank Zappa. Wouldn't play me some Frank Zappa. Play me the Mavish Duxture. Wouldn't play me Mavish Duxture. Okay, can you play me some prog? And this tune starts up, and it was the first tune on Tales from Topographic Oceans, which is called The Dawn of Creation. I don't know. Yes, fans are shouting at me. How can you have a YouTube channel if you don't know the title of the track? Oh, I don't know what it's going to have some long title. I ain't going to even look it up. Anyway, because this is the point. The point I'm trying to make to you is that I did not know this track. I'd never really listened to it. There, I'm a progressive rock fan. I never listened to that first track. And that was the track that comes up. So it starts up and I go, well, this is nice. Sounds like Yes. So what Yes track's this? I don't know what it is. It's not off. That's not Relayer, is it? It's not. What is this track? And I thought, it's got it. And the thing was, it took me a while to dawn. And what I was listening to, and what I felt, was Yes at their best. As an older man now, being able to understand the aesthetic and not just be focusing on the virtuosity, which is what I was like when I was younger into Yes. Being able to focus on that English, romantic, mythical, futuristic, and yet ancient aesthetic that Yes have. And it always reminds me of the icy regions as well. There's an aspect of Yes which is as much as is English, but is also Arctic. If Yes were to be personified by an animal, it would be an Arctic fox. When you watch the Last Jedi, is that the one with, when Luke Skywalker comes back in the trio of awful, Star Wars comebacks film? When they go to that planet and it's got all that white there, and then you've got those foxes, running through the snow, that has got the same aesthetic that Yes has got. And Tales from Topographic Ocean is dripping with it. Now, do I like that aesthetic? I do, right? It is the very essence of prog, which is why at number 1, I have Tales from Topographic Ocean. So what you've just had there is my list of the most 10 proggiest albums of the 70s. I just want to keep it where it was, classic prog. They are there. That's what they are. That's them. All right. Now, anybody who knows secretly, that is the best 10 progressive rock albums, right? We haven't had to count out to bloody Tubular Bells or Dark Side of the Moon or any of that stuff that sits on the fringe. This is full-on prog. This is the one, right? And think about it. If I was doing this for real, right, and I wasn't whispering, Close to the Edge would be number one, wouldn't it? But when I do it like this, it's Tales from Topographic Oceans. I think we need to, I mean, because Tales from Topographic was really seen as an artistic failure, even though it probably sold millions at the time. And then as time's gone on, its brilliance has clawed back. It's slowly clawed back some reputation. It's nearly there now. We need to champion this album, don't we? Tales from Topographic Oceans needs to be placed at the peak of the mountain of Prog in 1973, and it needs to take its place alongside Dark Side of the Moon and Tubular Bells and all those other huge multi-million selling albums, and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. They're the four, aren't they? They're the four. We might even stick Passion Play in there. Is that 1973? I did say, I can't remember now. Anyway, if you liked this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see more, please subscribe. If you want to support me financially, you can go to my Patreon, and the link is down below. And there you will get lots and lots of content. You will actually get to hear music, because I play music on there, because YouTube's evil copyright thing, grabbing thing isn't there. And so you get to hear music, see me react to music. There is also loads of albums. There's loads of content, articles, and all that sort of stuff. On top of that, we have the Patreon meeting. I'm about to do one tomorrow, where we ought to get together in Zoom, and you can watch those chats as well. And we have the Patreon WhatsApp group, where everyone can get together and talk about the weird music that none of your friends or family want to talk to you about, right? And it's £5 a month. And that's it, right? It is a proper little club now. And that's the future of music. But if you are a busy person, you think, I'd love to do any, but I'm a busy man. You know, I'm a successful middle-aged gentleman that likes my progressive rock, but I have a lot of very important business to attend to. So I cannot join your Patreon, because I knew it would take up too of my time. But I am a wealthy man, because I've got my own business, and in my own spare time, I've got my big stereo, and I can sit and play my, you know, heavyweight vinyl versions of Tubular Bells in the, you know, all that. If you're that type of person and you want to help me and support me, you can go to my YouTube, PayPal tip jar. That's in there down below. About a month ago, I made the big leap of doing this full time, which is what I'm now doing. I have ideas, so anybody who sticks any money in that is supporting me to do that. Please support me to do it, because this is stressful. But you've got to keep moving forward, haven't you? That's the thing. Right, we're finished. Right, thanks for watching. I'm going to switch this off now.